Star Wars has some of the most powerful warships out there, from Star Destroyers, Star Dreadnoughts, and Super Star Destroyers. But how would another sci-fi universe also known for awesome warships fare in the galaxy far, far away? That's right, we're going to discuss the UNSC and Covenant's most prominent warships, then see how they would fare against the most powerful Star Wars vessels. Star Wars has some really cool Star Destroyers like the Venator class, Imperial class, Resurgent class, and Nebula class. Those are a few of my favorites, but I also love the designs of the Halo universe warships. The UNSC and Covenant both have their unique vessels, but let's specifically dive into the UNSC for a moment. The United Nations Space Command employs a number of warships from corvettes, frigates, destroyers, cruisers, carriers, and super carriers, like the UNSC Infinity. Now, I could run through a list of each specific class, their crew, weapon systems, etc., but we'd be here all day because really the lore for Halo is actually quite extensive. Instead, I will list a few models and classes, while also going over some of the more notable UNSC warships. Starting with the little guys, we have corvettes. Models such as the Gladius class and Mako class were typically outgunned in every engagement and had to rely on their small size to survive. The Charon-class light frigate's most notable vessel was the UNSC Forward Unto Dawn, whereas the UNSC Ember-clad was a stalwart-class light frigate. Other classes like the Mulsanne, Paris, and Strident heavy frigate were also utilized. These frigates were typically around 450 to 500 meters and were well armed for their size. Next, we have the destroyers. I could only find around 3 different classes, those being the Diligence class, Hillsborough class, and Halberd class light destroyers. The latter class famously performed the Keys Loop, a maneuver that allowed the UNSC Iroquois to destroy and force the retreat from multiple Covenant vessels single-handedly. Destroyers were typically around 480 to 550 meters in length. UNSC cruiser models have similar structures most people will relate with the UNSC Pillar of Autumn, which was specifically a Halcyon class light cruiser. Others like the Marathon class heavy cruiser, Autumn class heavy cruiser, and Valiant class super heavy cruiser came with 1 or 2 heavy coil max and some powerful coil guns and nuclear weapon systems. With the cruiser classes, we see a jump in size from 1100 to 1500 meters in length. Now we're getting closer to those Venators and ISDs. But when the UNSC really wanted to bring the firepower, they brought their carriers. I'll definitely talk about the Infinity class, don't worry. But first I want to mention the Approach class, Orion class, Poseidon class, and Punic class. But of course everyone should know the Phoenix class carrier as the UNSC Spirit of Fire from Halo Wars. It's easily one of my favorite vessels despite how outdated it is during its major engagements. Time to reach for the top of the shelf for the UNSC Infinity and UNSC Eternity, both models being Infinity class supercarriers. I'm going to spend some time breaking down this class because these vessels are, well, frankly crazy. To start, they are around 5,694 meters in length with a mass of 970 million metric tons. That's more than 3 times the length of an Imperial class Star Destroyer. These supercarriers were also unique as they had heavy dispersal field generators, basically really strong deflector shields. The armament on Infinity class supercarriers was also insane. Allow me to run through it. 350 Archer missile pods with 24 missiles per pod, 250 Rapier missile pods with 30 missiles per pod, 500 Howler missile pods with 20 missiles per pod, 830 Fortress 70mm guns, 10 dorsal Mark II 551 Max, 85 dorsal anti-aircraft guns, 190 dorsal guided missile weapon systems, and several Havoc tactical nuclear weapons. But to top it all off, it has 4 CR-03 Series 8 Max, 2 on the bow and 2 bow flank. You could say the supercarrier is armed with every advanced weapon system humanity has developed. Not only can it fight in slugging matches, but it can straight up ram smaller Covenant warships thanks to its shielding system and the insane mass of the vessel. This is easily the greatest vessel humanity has, and can I just say that I love the names Infinity and Eternity? That's just fantastic. Not to mention all the other cool names of vessels I previously listed. But what about the Covenant, you say? Well, they have as much of a complicated list as the UNSC, but considering these vessels are the closest to Star Wars vessels, I won't take too much time. Just like the UNSC, they have corvettes, frigates, destroyers, cruisers, and carriers. The Sudar pattern heavy corvette was 956 meters in length and was heavily armed when compared to UNSC corvettes. It had heavy plasma cannons, plasma bombardment mortars, and pulse lasers. These corvettes could easily take on some of humanity's best frigates. Esther pattern armored frigates were similar in size but armed with heavier plasma cannons, pulse lasers, plasma lances, and plasma beam emitters. Cineris pattern heavy destroyers were around 1,600 meters long. They had the standard weaponry as well as plasma torpedo silos and super heavy excavation beam emitters. Covenant cruisers like the Varric pattern heavy cruiser were 3,000 meters long and had some heavy firepower, from cannons, bombardment mortars, pulse lasers, torpedoes, and excavation beams. Other vessels like the Ket pattern battle cruiser were a little over half the size of the previous cruiser and had less plasma weapon systems. Similar to the UNSC, when the Covenant wanted to bring the muscle, they brought their supercarriers. Corel pattern assault carriers were over 5,000 meters in length and 2.7 billion metric tons. Weapon systems were essentially the same as other Covenant vessels, with many more emplacements. Shawata pattern supercarriers were insanely large at 28,960 meters and 152 billion metric tons. I mean, that's as big as some of the largest superstar dreadnoughts in Star Wars. One major factor that makes the Covenant's navy so deadly is also their complement of fighters and bombers, which would be able to outmatch the UNSC fighters with relative ease. But to get to the main topic of this discussion, now that we know the most common warships between these two factions, how would they fare in Star Wars? Star Wars has some pretty insanely large vessels, and when it comes to ship-to-ship combat, the Star Destroyers of the Republic and Empire dominate. Not to mention CIS Navy warships like the Subjugator class Star Dreadnought. Frankly, putting any of the UNSC vessels in combat, other than the Infinity class, would surely result in defeat. However, I think there could be a number of scenarios where a UNSC vessel could surprise an ISD. But if we're talking about straight up slugging matches, the turbo lasers would shred the armor of just about any UNSC warship. The Infinity class is a totally different story, considering its massive amount of firepower, size, and the fact that it has some of the most advanced shields in Halo. I wholly agree that the Infinity class supercarriers would hold their own against navies from the Empire or Republic. I mean, if I'm being honest, they would probably actually destroy most vessels, unless we bring in some Executor class or Subjugator class Star Dreadnoughts. Covenant vessels are a little bit of a different story. Unlike the UNSC, most of their warships would fare relatively well. All Covenant vessels have energy shields, plasma cannons, and pulse lasers. Some even have stronger weapons like plasma torpedoes and excavator beams. Their complement of strike craft probably wouldn't do that well against starfighters, considering how well starfighters maneuver, but to be fair, both universes have a different grasp on physics. In truth, I really think that the Covenant would pose a threat, especially if they came in full force. But that's enough of my ramblings. I want to hear your guys' thoughts and opinions below. Let me know if you think the UNSC or Covenant could handle Star Wars warships. Consider subscribing to the channel if you enjoy being a nerd, and like this video if you enjoyed the topic and speculation. Have an incredibly nerdy day, and may the Force be with you.